Hello and welcome to another Word from the Street and me, David Ford from Expert Link. And this week I want to talk about the values in begging. So I've recently been involved in a summit on street attachment and antisocial behaviour, but it was just part of what I've been seeing lately around street cultures and in particular begging, or should we say how to deal with beggars. So firstly, let's just address this term beggars, shall we, because it sucks. It's so degrading, yet we persist in using it to describe people. Personally, using the phrase people who are forced to beg seems so much more less degrading and stigmatising. I know that some of you will disagree, but I also know that most of you don't want to see people beg. Some of you will be coming from a place of compassion, while others not. But ultimately, we all know in our hearts that if we want to change behaviour, the worst thing that we can do is to keep people down by using the language that we use on them, or use on them and about them, you know. So let's move on to the meaty stuff, shall we? The values in begging. So I was in my local park a couple of weeks ago thinking about values. I was thinking about my values, Expert Links, and the values of others and of other organisations. And you know, for me, values, they're so important, and they act as the compass, if you like, that keeps us on track. They are the things that make us feel the way that we do and drive us to do the things that we do. Regardless of whether we're consciously aware of them or not, they're there. That's just the way that it is. So on my journey through life, I've met so many people who have suffered from multiple disadvantage. They've been homeless, been caught up in the criminal justice system, suffered from mental illness, and more often than not, struggling with an addiction. I've sat down with people forced to beg, even tried it myself. I have met people who have committed ghastly crimes, but yet in all but a handful of those that I've ever met, which is probably in the thousands by now, they all had two things in common. Firstly, they were all products of their environments, like like you, and generally speaking, grew up in pretty grim or unspeakable conditions. Secondly, they all had values, just as you do. Now, you might want to argue that the value set is different to yours, and you can. But you know, once you dig deep and start uncovering core values, just like you, they have generally recognised right from wrong and value it. Now, I know that some of you are going to find that hard to believe, but stick with me for a while and I'll argue the case, yeah? So let's take a typical picture of someone who is forced to beg. Typically, they've suffered from some form of childhood abuse, trauma or neglect. They've probably not grown up in an environment where they have learnt the social and communication skills that you need to survive in this world. And they certainly probably didn't get the best of the education system. They've typically found and used drugs or alcohol to self-medicate. That's about managing the trauma and distress that they're suffering from. They undoubtedly suffer some form of mental illness, and when they've engaged with the system, it has typically resulted in a negative experience for them. Think about the care system for a moment, and social services as a child, the criminal justice system, the welfare system. They can all be negative experiences. Now, I don't know if you've ever suffered from any form of addiction, but if you have, you know that they can be really tough to beat. And it doesn't matter what it is, does it? Whether it's cake, coffee, sweets, biting your nails, football, sport, sex, porn, alcohol or drugs, it doesn't matter. They're all hard to beat. And that's because it's about the reward systems and how we function at a chemical and neurological way as human beings. For a lot of those who have been forced to beg, they have found drugs or alcohol as a form of escaping or dealing with the trauma that they've offered or suffered. For a lot of those who've been forced to beg, they have found drugs or alcohol as a form of escaping or dealing with the trauma that they've suffered. And why wouldn't they? Wouldn't you want to escape all the things going inside your head if you had suffered as they have? I know that I did. Using drugs and alcohol would obviously lead to addiction, both physically and mentally. And the addiction can become the one single thing that rules and controls your life. It dictates what you do. It dictates when you do it, and often who with. It makes the decisions for you. So I hope that most of you, if not all, who are reading this have never ever been forced to beg. I can't even start to explain how degrading as a human being having to beg is. To expose yourself to abuse and to humiliation by sitting outside a tube station with a cup in your hand. This is the lowest that any human being can fall. Any modicum of self-worth or self-esteem that you have disappears the moment you sit down. The fear of abuse, or worse still, someone recognising you, is horrendous. So if you have an addiction that controls your life and you can't throw it off, and you don't have the income or the money to fund it, what do? Give up the addiction is probably what you're screaming at me right now. But what if you can't? What if the addiction is so strong, or the fear of what will happen if in your head without the drugs or alcohol is so enormous you just can't give it up? What if the physical addiction alone causes you so much pain that you have to have what you use in order to relieve it? Well, what a lot of people would do is turn to crime. They would go to grafting, that is shoplifting or robbing, in through the back door, out through the front with someone's laptop under their arms. Hey, the chances of getting caught are quite low these days, and if you get caught, you probably won't go to prison. But hey, who's worried about prison these days either? Now back to those we see on the street who are forced to beg. We can imagine the likely environment that they grew up in and the challenges that they have suffered. We can be pretty sure that they are suffering from some sort of mental illness and are caught up in an addiction that controls their very being. And yet, with all this, they choose to completely humiliate and degrade themselves to serve their addiction. They have chosen not to rob you or anyone else, but instead inflict the degrading humiliation upon themselves. Against everything. Is that not the single most powerful demonstration of acting out your values? They recognise honesty, but in order to be true to that value, they have had to endure what no human being should ever have to endure. Yet they do it. You can argue with me if you choose, but unless you have suffered in the same way and been forced to do the same things, unless your knowledge goes beyond the classroom or the internet, then forgive me for holding my position. And that is that even those who are deemed by society to be the most lowest of the low, they have values and, more importantly, act them out in the most adverse conditions. And that is more than can be said for most of us. If you agree with me, please smash the like button. I'd love to hear your comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you've ever been forced to beg, please get in touch with me. We'd love to hear from you. And for those of you who disagree with me, I'd love to hear your comments too. But that's enough for me for today. Until next time, I love you all. Stay safe.
Don't give up. Don't give up. Don't give up. Don't give up. No matter what.